My name is Nasreen Khadimi. I'm a national team member for Settlement Portfolio. And I'm today you're joining with Zia and our colleague at Settlement, Nuremeen. A quick introduction to Settlement. So I'm going to share my screen here, if I could. Thank you so much again, and a little brief introduction to Settlement. We are working in 4 phases with the newcomers. The first phase is pre-arrival, which focuses on preparation and when the Jamaat members are still in their host country. And then the second is the adjustment phase, when Jamaat member are already in Canada and has been in Canada for a year or less. And as you can see, there are all different areas and categories that we are helping the new arrivals, including the housing and language training and connecting them to internal, external agencies for helping them to get settled in Canada. And then the adaptation phase is once they are in Canada from 2 to 3 years, which is the phase that they are settled, creating, making sure that they have a proper goal, educational, if they are looking to get education, we have support system for them, providing them training. One of the example is RKI. It's a mentorship and goal setting program. And then the last one is the integration, which the new arrivals are already settled in Canada and are ready or eligible to get their citizenship. But this is a brief information. All this information can be found on II Canada. If you have any other question, you can always call the access line. I'll ask my colleague Nuremeen to write the number in the chat for you guys for the access line. But yeah, that's another good way. If you're not sure when to contact Settlement Portfolio, you can call us. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. If you have any questions about Settlement, you're welcome to send us a chat, but also you can call the access line. So now going to Zia. Zia has been serving with the Settlement Portfolio for a while, but she's our expert in economic immigration and refugee and citizenship. She has been practicing and is a lawyer in Ontario. And so we are going, sorry, Zia, I'm not going to give a full introduction, but that's a very brief, and I'm going to now pass it on to you. And just to remind you guys, please, if you have any question while Zia is speaking, feel free to add your questions in the chat, and we'll be happy to answer them as we go through.
Thank you so much. So let's jump right in. Today, we're going to be talking about citizenship. And of course, this is a very important area. We've heard it multiple times, really important to be applying for citizenship. And so today, we want to look at benefits of applying, what the requirements are, so how someone can be eligible to apply for their citizenship, what the process is, and then we'll get into some questions. Like we just said, feel free to put your questions in the chat or in the Q&A box. My apologies, put it in the Q&A box and we will address them. We will take questions and respond to everything that is being posted. So let's jump right in. There are many benefits to applying for citizenship, okay? The first one, you do not need to renew your permanent resident card. So once you are a Canadian citizen, you do not need to have valid PR cards. And even further than that, you're eligible for a Canadian passport, okay? Which of course in itself has a number of benefits, especially when you're traveling outside of Canada, means that you don't have to worry about having a valid PR card when you're trying to return back to Canada, which we're seeing right now as a huge positive, especially because the processing times for PR cards have, especially during COVID, have become much longer. So one, don't have to worry about those PR cards. You get a Canadian passport, and of course that does have it does provide benefit in terms of entry requirements for other countries. There are no residency requirements to remain a Canadian citizen, okay? So citizens of Canada are permitted to live outside of Canada for extended periods of time without having to worry about keeping a track of your days so that you maintain your status. So as we know, permanent residents, you have to remain in Canada for 2 out of any 5-year period. Now, that's not continuous, it's cumulative, but it is something that you still do need to keep track of and do need to note and ensure that you do meet, because without that, your permanent resident status in itself is in jeopardy. That's no longer a problem once you become a Canadian citizen, right? As there are no residency requirements. And as Imam has said in his 4 months, he discusses making Canada your home and subsequently giving back to the development of other countries. Goes right to this, right? Becoming a citizen, we don't have to worry about the number of days that we spend inside or outside of Canada, and we can go and contribute and give back for extended periods of time to other countries outside of Canada. The third benefit of obtaining your citizenship is that Canadian citizens have the ability to vote, work in specific federal government jobs, and hold political office. These are things that are not available to permanent residents. And, you know, we've just gone through an election, and we can see the importance of having a voice and being able to cast your vote and play a part in our system. So another big benefit of applying or obtaining your citizenship, of course, is having that ability to vote and contributing back. The fourth benefit of applying for citizenship is that when you are a permanent resident, there are, especially if you've received your permanent residence through refugee programs, permanent residents who go back to their countries of origin, we are seeing a huge amount of CBSA officers right now looking for these specific situations and then putting that PR status in itself in jeopardy. And this counts for even short trips where you're going back for a funeral, for weddings, going back to visit family. All of this can be problematic. Fifth benefit of applying for citizenship is that with the recent changes in our criminal system, and especially the increase in penalties for certain offenses, there is the ability, there's more ability now to lose your permanent residence because of certain offenses, especially recently how we've seen changes with the DUI laws. Now, of course, we're not saying that, you know, it's ever okay, but you do want to keep in mind that a Canadian citizen cannot lose citizenship because of criminality, okay? Canadian citizens are only subject to the penalties of the Canadian judicial system. So with that in mind, now that you're all convinced that you do need to apply for citizenship and that there are big benefits of becoming a Canadian citizen, what I want to start looking at are how we can apply and what the requirements, what the eligibility criteria are for submitting and applying for your citizenship. The first one and the most obvious one, you have to be a permanent resident of Canada. So we cannot apply for citizenship unless you have first obtained permanent residence. The second one is your presence. So when you're applying for citizenship, there is a physical presence requirement, okay? You have to be physically present as a permanent resident in Canada for at least 3 out of the past 5 years. So when you apply, when you submit your application, on that date, we look back 5 years. And in those 5 years, you need to have a total of 1,095 days in Canada in order to be eligible to apply for citizenship. Okay, and again, that's not consecutive, it is cumulative. So we're looking at a total of 1,095 days. Now, time that you've spent, so if you were in Canada as a temporary resident before obtaining your permanent residence, you can actually count that time as a temporary resident towards this 1,095 days, so towards your physical presence requirement. The way that we do that is each day that you spend as a temporary resident counts, so gives you a credit of half a day, up to a maximum credit of a year. So let's take an example. If you've been here as a temporary resident and then you applied for your permanent residence within Canada, you can, and let's say you were here as an international student or as a foreign worker, you held status for 3 years before you became a permanent resident. And then after becoming a permanent resident, you've now spent 2 years in Canada, okay? Because you have the time before, right? So if you remember, we said that each day as a temporary resident counts as half a day. So if you spent 3 years as a temporary resident, you would get that maximum credit of a year, which means you only need to spend 2 years as a permanent resident in order to meet that 1,095 days and be eligible to apply for your citizenship. Now, there used to also be a requirement that on top of the 1,095 days, you also needed to be in Canada for 183 days in any given year in order to use that year towards your residency requirement. That was removed in 2017. We still do get this question a lot, if it's still a requirement, and it's not. So when we're talking about physical presence, the only things you need to keep in mind are the 1,095 days, and if you're eligible, the credit that you can get as a temporary resident. The third requirement when we're talking about applying for citizenship is that you have to file your taxes here in Canada. So if you are required to file your taxes, then again, looking back at those 5 years, you would need to have filed your taxes for at least the 3 years that you're using for your physical presence requirement, okay? So, we're still looking back the 5 years and we still have the number 3 in terms of how many years you have to file your taxes. And of course, this is at a minimum. For those applicants that are between the ages of 18 and 54, you will also need to complete you need to prove that you meet the language requirements, okay? So for citizenship, we're only looking at speaking and listening, and you have to be able to demonstrate a Canadian level benchmark of 4 in each of these categories, okay? So when you submit your application, if you're between the ages of 18 and 54, the date that you submit, you do need to include proof that you meet this language requirement. Additionally, for applicants that are between, again, 18 to 54, you will also have to do a Canadian knowledge test. That comes after we've applied, so it's not something that needs to be submitted with the initial application. And we'll talk about it a little more when we go through the process of applying. And then lastly, going back to our benefits here, there can't be any reason that you're not eligible for citizenship, okay? Part of that is if you've committed a crime inside or outside of Canada, that can be problematic in terms of being eligible to submit your application and obtain that Canadian citizenship. But that's it. These are really the main requirements. These are the requirements that we're talking about in order for someone to be eligible to apply for citizenship. So let's next look at that process, right? What does the process of applying for citizenship look like? The first thing you want to do, of course, is review the eligibility requirements, which is what we just did, right? You want to look at your own background, take the requirements that we've just talked about, and ensure that you qualify when you're applying, so when you're submitting your application, okay? And one of the biggest things, and where I spend the most time looking at, is the physical presence, right? Remember that 1,095 days. That is usually where we see a lot of people miscalculate or not be eligible yet to apply. Look at your exact dates. If you're here as a permanent resident still, and you're thinking about applying or you're on your route to applying, keep a track of the dates that you're traveling inside and outside of Canada. It'll help you when you actually go and prepare this application. For those of you that are ready to apply, go online onto IRCC's website. They have a physical presence calculator. It's very straightforward. You enter your dates onto the calculator, and it'll tell you exactly how many days you have, right? but really important. Spend that time, go through, your history in terms of your passport, or look at whenever you have trip confirmations. You want to take all of that and really sit down and calculate your entry, your exit dates, so you know that for sure, without a doubt, you have that 1,095 days and you are eligible to submit that citizenship application. Now, once you've gone through it, you've looked at your dates, you say, yes, I know I have more than the 1,095 that I need. What's next? Well, the next step then is to compile your application, right? Getting your application together. The absolute minimum is the documents that are listed on IRCC's document checklist, okay? So when you're preparing the citizenship application, you have to go online, download the application form from IRCC's website, download their document checklist, and those are your absolute minimum, okay? The checklist outlines exactly what IRCC officers are looking for in order for your application to be marked complete. So for example, you need to provide all pages of your passport, and you have to provide a color copy. If you don't do that, your application is considered incomplete and your application will be sent back to you, okay? So absolutely important, make sure you're looking at IRCC's document checklist. That is the absolute minimum in terms of what you need in order to have a complete application, so that your application actually does get processed, okay? And you want to, of course, take a look at the application form, prepare that form. It goes through your background. It's the basic information that they require in terms of making sure who you are and that you qualify for your citizenship. We've touched upon this, review those applications and documents before you submit. Now, like I said, IRCC's document checklist is a great starting point. It's not always everything that every applicant will need to include, okay? And what I mean by that is it's really important, the citizenship application, one of the main things that the officer is looking at is to see that you qualify in terms of your physical presence. In order to do that, they're looking at your entry and exit dates. So how do they do that? Well, one, they're going to be looking at your passport, right? So they're going to go through, they're going to look at the stamps on your passport. And so we always advise make sure that you're also checking that before you submit your application. But if there are other things that you have, like your boarding passes, or if you have proof that you've worked in Canada, those may also be helpful for your citizenship application. So all that to say, the minimum documents for your application to be complete are those that are found on that IRCC checklist. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's everything that you may possibly need for your application, okay? It does help to have documents in there to show that you met that residency requirement. So travel documents, anything to show when you exited, when you re-entered Canada. Once you have all of that ready, you've gone through it, you've looked at the document checklist, you've gone through your form, you have that all signed. The next step is to pay your application fees and to actually submit your application. So right now, IRCC, actually this past year, IRCC has created an online portal. So citizenship applications can now actually be submitted online as well. Previously, it was only by mail. So now there are two options. It can be couriered in, it can be mailed in to IRCC, or you can actually also now submit it online as well. Either way, do make sure that you pay the application fees, okay? Without those application fees, again, your application will be considered incomplete and it won't be processed. It'll be returned to you, right? Now, given the timelines in terms, and we'll talk about, the processing times, but you don't want to be in a position where your application gets submitted, you think you're in queue to be processed, but because it was incomplete, maybe you forgot to pay the fees, maybe you forgot a document, your application gets sent back to you, but that doesn't happen for months, okay? And so you've lost that time and then have to restart that entire process again. Better take that time, make sure that you have everything you need before it gets submitted. Now, once you've submitted your application, the first thing that IRCC does when they actually receive that application, and when it goes to IRCC, for example, if it goes into their mailroom, it sits there for a period of time first. Okay, it doesn't get opened right away. There is quite a backlog, especially now during COVID. But once they do receive it, they go through it. The first thing they're going to do is ensure that it's a complete application and that it has the required fees. Okay, if the officer that's reviewing it says, yes, it is complete, yes, we have the right fees, that's when you will receive what's called an acknowledgement of receipt. Okay, so it's a letter from IRCC saying, yes, confirming we've received your application and now we are actually going to process it. So when you receive that acknowledgement of receipt, all it means is that your application is complete and that it's now being put into queue for processing. Okay, does not mean that it's been approved just yet. It doesn't mean that anyone's actually gone through in terms of your eligibility criteria, but they've basically just said we have what we need in order to now start reviewing that application. From there, generally, there's a long period of time before we hear anything further. During this time, if the officer has any questions in terms of further documents they want, for example, if they want you to get an RCMP police certificate, if they want you to get fingerprints done, this is the period in time where you'll receive that correspondence from IRCC. But like I said, there is going to be generally a big gap of time, so don't be concerned, if you're not hearing anything right away. What I do recommend is that once you do have the acknowledgement of receipt, you can actually go online and create an account through IRCC's Citizenship Application Tracker. I do highly recommend it because this is where you'll find the best information in terms of updates on your application. What we've been finding is that even before IRCC is sending out notices for citizenship tests or for the ceremony, the update is first coming in the Citizenship Tracker portal. So that's where we recommend that you do make sure that you have that portal set up and that you're checking it regularly, because unlike other portals where emails are sent out when there's an update, there's no email that's being sent out to say, hey, we've updated something on your citizenship portal. It is on the individual themselves to actually just go in and take a look and see if there are any updates. Now, after this, the next step for applicants that are between the ages of 18 and 54 is receiving that notice for the citizenship test, right? So if you remember when we talked about eligibility requirements, we said that applicants between 18 and 54 have two extra steps, right? One is that language, proving the language proficiency, which is submitted with the initial application. And the second is doing a citizenship knowledge test. And this is the point in time where they would be invited to basically go online and take the knowledge test. Pre-COVID, everything was done in person. So you would get a letter saying, okay, this is when your citizenship test is. You need to come in on that specific date. Now, what IRCC has done since they've moved online is they're providing applicants with a 3-week period, so 21 days, during those 21 days, you can log in at any time and complete that test. Now, important to know though, in order to do that online test, you do need to have a computer with a webcam and access to reliable internet, right? The test itself is 30 minutes long and it consists of 20 multiple choice questions. But during those 30 minutes, if you lose connection, if you're signed off for whatever reason, so if you're disconnected, that timer doesn't stop, okay? So really important to make sure before you start the citizenship test that you do have the 30 minutes that you'll need in order to finish the test. Of those 20 multiple choice questions, it's not a perfect score that they're looking for. You have to get 15 of them at least correct in order to pass the test. When you submit the test at that 30-minute mark, you'll automatically get your score, so you'll know right away whether or not you pass the test. The next step after that, right? So for applicants who are not within the ages of 18 and 54, or for those that are between 18 and 54 and have now passed the citizenship test, the next notification, the next step in the process is that you'll receive a date basically for your citizenship ceremony. Again, this is just sent by email And during COVID, it's completely gone online. So now we're seeing all applicants basically doing a video oath ceremony through Zoom. It did take a long time before IRCC moved to the online, and so they are catching up in terms of applicants. But it's a great step. Everything is moving to that online process, which is great. Downside, of course, is that you're doing it alone, whereas the citizenship ceremony used to be a great celebration, and you could have other people join you for it. Unfortunately, right now through Zoom, it's just that applicant, and there's no additional links provided. One important note is that throughout this entire process, you do have to make sure you maintain your eligibility requirements right until you take the oath of citizenship. Okay. Even if IRCCs evaluated you up until the point where you've given the oath, that's when you actually become a Canadian citizen. So really important to keep in mind that the process is ongoing until that point. IRCC still states that their current processing time is about 12 months, or supposed to be 12 months, and that's from when you submit your application to when you actually receive your citizenship. What we're finding is that applications that were submitted near the beginning of the pandemic, so anywhere between December 2019 and March 2020, they've taken much longer to process, and that's simply because there was a long pause in the citizenship tests and in the oath ceremonies, just because they were trying to move that online or figure out how to even do it, because everything was done in person before COVID. And so I think right now IRCC is playing a little bit of catch up in terms of addressing all the backlog of applications. But certainly we are still seeing some that are submitted later in the pandemic. So, December of last year, that are now getting their citizenship ceremony dates as well. So a mix of timelines. I think they are still trying to move back to the 12 months as much as possible for the overall processing times. Perfect. So with that, we'll move into so prior to this, we did compile some questions. And so we'll move into those first, and then we'll open it up to questions that we've received today.
Great. So if you guys, how do you want to do this, Zia? Sorry, we didn't have a debrief. Do you want me to read the question and you'll answer?
Sure.
Okay. So I'm still a citizen of another country. Will I lose that citizenship if I become a Canadian citizen?
Yeah, so under Canadian law, a Canadian is allowed dual citizenship. So you are able to be a citizen of Canada and of another country as well. However, some countries will not let you keep your citizenship if you become a Canadian citizen. And so, while Canada doesn't have any issues with it, you do also want to check with your first country of citizenship to see if there's going to be any issue from that end.
Great, thank you. Can I apply for a citizenship now, even though I will not have 3 years of residence until next month? So can I apply in advance before I have 3 years?
So this is definitely a frequent question we get, because, with the processing time taking a year, people want to get in queue so that their application will be processed as soon as possible. And, I understand that the processing time is a year, and so why waste that last month and not apply sooner? The problem is that the day that you sign your application form is the end of when they're looking at your fiscal presence. So you need to have accumulated those 1,095 days, the date that you sign your application form. Otherwise, that application will get refused, right? Because you won't have met the eligibility criteria, the 1,095 days when you're submitting your application. So short answer, unfortunately, no, you do need to have your full 1,095 days before you sign and submit that application.
That makes sense. Can I apply for citizenship the day that I met the residency requirements?
Technically, yes. Technically, you can submit your application as soon as you have that 1,095 days. However, the best practice is to give yourself a couple additional weeks. The reason we say that is sometimes, we're looking back 5 years. Sometimes there's short trips that you may have forgotten about, potentially going to the States, for example, for a weekend. I don't know that I would be able to tell you exactly, all the trips that I've done over 5 years. And that's not because I travel a lot, but just because, I don't always remember everything, right? And we don't always get stamps in our passports when we're traveling potentially just to the States, for example. And so if you're submitting your application just at the 1,095 days, you do run the risk that, let's say, when the IRCC officer pulls up your records, they're not just looking at the application and the dates that you provide, they're also comparing it to CVSI's records of your entries and your exits. And so if there is a short trip that you've forgotten about, which then brings you below the 1,095 days, unfortunately, that would mean that your application would be refused and you're starting all over again. So yes, you can apply right away. Generally, though, we don't recommend it. I would recommend that you give yourself some buffer time just in case there is anything that you've forgotten.
Okay, my application was returned or refused. Can I reapply? And if I do, how long do I have to wait?
Yeah, so you can definitely submit another application. There's no required amount of time that you need to wait. So, you can get your application back on a Monday and resubmit it on a Wednesday or on a Tuesday. There's no real period of time that you have to wait. However, you do want to make sure that you're addressing any issues that the officer found in the initial application, right? So if you were missing a document, or if you were, if you didn't provide the right form, if the form was outdated, don't submit the exact same application again, right? Because, you're likely just going to get that back as well. You want to make sure that you're addressing whatever concerns the officer had with that initial application when you're resubmitting your next application.
Sorry, a follow-up question for me. Will they let me know if my application is rejected, what was the reason for the rejection?
Great question. It depends. So, you get a standard refusal letter with your application when your application. So let's say it's returned, you get your standard letter. Most of the time you'll see something on there that says, okay, missing documents. Let's say, for example, you forgot to include your entire passport. You'll get the refusal letter, it'll highlight that, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's everything that's wrong with your application, right? Once an officer finds, if they're saying that your application is incomplete, for example, they're not evaluating the rest of it. They're not going through it and saying, okay, do you have everything else that we're looking for, right? So, yes, of course, make sure that you're addressing what they've highlighted on that refusal letter or that rejection letter, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's everything that you need to think about. There could be something else that you also have to address.
Okay, so basically it's my responsibility to make sure my document and everything is complete and accurate before I submit my application.
For sure. And then even one step further than that, because there's usually a period of time between when you submit your application and when you get it back, you do have to also make sure that your forms, that the document checklist you're using, everything is up to date, right? Because they do also change frequently as well.
Awesome. Another question is, what documents can I use to demonstrate the language requirements?
Yeah. So IRCC's website actually outlines exactly what documents are accepted in terms of demonstrating this language proficiency requirement. Now, just to give you a couple examples, an IELTS or a CELPIP general test is fine, even if it's expired. So for those of you that applied for permanent residence here in Canada using one of the economic programs, and so you had an IELTS general test, for example, it may have been 4 years ago that you applied, but you can still use that same test even if it's expired, as long as it shows that you meet the language requirements for your citizenship. Alternatively, if you've done a secondary or post-secondary program, whether it's inside or outside of Canada, that's either completed in English or French, you can send proof of completing that program. If you completed the LINK language training, the language instruction for newcomers to Canada program, and you received CLB4 in speaking and listening, you can also provide a copy of that certificate as well. There are the other documents that IRCC accepts. The full list is on IRCC's website.
Okay, another question. This is my favorite question. I was asking this when I was about to get my citizenship. Can I leave Canada after I mail my application?
Yes, can submit your application now, since we can also do it online. Yes, you can definitely leave Canada after IRCC receives your application. But what you do want to make sure is that you remain eligible for citizenship. And where we see that come up is if you're close to your physical presence requirement, right? Especially because there's always a risk that for whatever reason, if your application's returned and you need to apply again, you want to make sure that you are still eligible to apply for citizenship. And then the other part is that the citizenship test and the oath ceremony, you do have to be in Canada when you're taking them. Okay, so those two requirements have to be while you're physically present in Canada. So when you receive a date for it, they don't generally give you too much lead time. I can tell you for the oath ceremony, for example, it's generally about 10 days notice, and you get basically a date and time saying, okay, this is when your oath ceremony is. And it can be very difficult to try and change that. So yes, you can be outside of Canada, but I would recommend, making sure that you're flexible in terms of returning to Canada, and that, if you do need a PR card, for example, you have that with you and valid.
Follow-up question about that. Mm-hmm. So right now that everything is online, how would Government of Canada know if I am inside Canada or outside?
Yeah, so when you actually go online, you have to declare that you're here. Okay, so it is part of it that you are physically present.
Okay, thank you. Can I take the citizenship test? Oh yeah, we already answered that question.
So short answer is no. No, we cannot.
What happens if I fail the Canadian citizenship test, the knowledge test?
Yeah, so you have two opportunities to take the knowledge test. If you fail the second time, then generally they schedule you for a hearing with a citizenship officer where an oral version of the test is given. If there's particular needs, if there's a special need that you have when you're taking the test, you can ask for accommodations in advance. So, something to keep in mind, something to talk about a professional about before you submit your application.
Awesome. Okay, one more question. Once I have had this citizenship test, how long do I need to wait before the citizenship ceremony?
So it varies, and especially right now, because of COVID, like I said, there was a huge pause in the oath ceremonies. And so the timelines I found over the last year and a half have fluctuated. Generally, pre-COVID, it was about 3 to 6 months after your citizenship test, just depending on when that was even scheduled in the first place. But the results of the citizenship test you do get right away. So at least you'll know where you're at.
Another question is whether the current impact of COVID-19 on getting citizenship.
So like we mentioned, there's definitely delays in processing times, especially for those that applied early in the pandemic. And then over the last year, we've seen everything move online, right? So the citizenship test, the oath ceremony, all of that has gone online, which has been a benefit, especially for the citizenship test. Before with the knowledge test, it was you just got a date and a time and you had to be there for it. Right now with the online test, you get a 3-week period during which you can log in at any time to take the test. So there is a little bit more flexibility with that, which is nice for applicants. You do get a period of time, whereas there wasn't that before. But otherwise, the biggest impact is, of course, the processing times.
Okay, well, looks like that's all the pre-questions we had. These were very, very helpful, and I think it answered a lot of the questions in Q&A, but we have some questions in Q&A, and I wanted to see if Nouramin would like to take that.
Sure, yeah. So I won't be answering them, but I'll lean on Zia, of course, to guide us through this discussion as well. So Zia, very quickly, we have about 12 questions that have come in. I want to make sure that we get through all of them. But if we don't, I will put in my own email address as well as Zia, so that if you guys have any further questions, you can connect with us. So firstly, I think you might have addressed this question. An individual came on a work permit and then they got their PR subsequently. And then I think you mentioned that half of the time that they are in their work permit is considered for citizenship eligibility, right?
Yeah, so the way we calculate it is that each day you spent as a temporary resident counts as half a day up to a maximum credit of 1 year.
Perfect. And then, so does visitor visa count as a temporary visitor as well?
Yeah, so if you're here as a visitor, if you have status as a visitor, then yes, you can still use that.
Okay, perfect. Another question that has come forward is if an individual has done their IELTS exam, let's say back in 2017, would they be able to use that as proof of their language test, or do they need to provide another one?
So if it's the IELTS general test, then yes, they can use that. So expired language tests, the IELTS itself, if that are expired, are still eligible.
Okay, perfect. And then an individual has asked about possibly in terms of providing evidence to the government documentation, would they need to provide the tax returns for the 3 years that they are here? I think you mentioned that as one of the requirements, right?
Yeah, so again, look at the checklist that IRCC posts, but it is, the eligibility requirement is that you have filed your taxes for at least 3 years in the past 5 years. When you fill out the application form, it is on there as well to say that you authorize IRCC to receive information from CRA for your taxes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, let me see. I think we touched on dual citizenship already. So I think we don't need to elaborate that one. And I think there's another question which we might have addressed, but I'll just phrase it here. Let's say an individual has submitted their application. Is it advisable for them to travel to home country for vacations or to stay put until?
I can't answer whether it's advisable for a particular individual. I can tell you that it is possible. So there's no requirement that you remain in Canada while your entire citizenship application is in process. Whether or not it's advisable for a particular situation, that would be dependent on an individual's background. And so the best thing I would recommend is contact a professional who'd be able to actually answer that in terms of their background.
Perfect. There was a comment made in the chat that, and I wanted to confirm with you, was the Canadian Border Service Agency. Do they keep a track of your entry and exits, and would we be able to obtain that from them?
They do now. They definitely do now. You can request it through an ATIP. IRCC says that they don't recommend doing that in advance. It does take a really long time to get an ATIP. Sorry, an ATIP is an access to information and privacy request. So you can, where you will get the dates, but you don't necessarily need to do that when you're, you don't have to have that when you're submitting your application. There's different ways for you to validate your dates. If you're a new permanent resident, I always recommend, keep a diary of your entry and exits. When you become a permanent resident, IRCC actually now also sends you a journal or like a PDF document to say, okay, track your dates on here. If you have done that, it makes it really easy. You just input that onto the calculator and you're good to go. If you don't have that though, you want to look back, look at your passport. There are usually stamps in there that'll help. Look at, travel itineraries, any confirmations that you have in your email, talk to your friends, your parents, any family members that would potentially know, when you traveled where, that can be helpful. But the short answer is yes, you can do an access to information request, but it's not mandatory.
Mm-hmm. Okay, awesome. You might have touched upon this, but let's see that. So an individual said, my parents have been in Canada for about 4 years and they're over 65. If they don't travel, what other advantages might they have for them to apply for citizenship than staying with permanent residence as their status?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are definitely benefits still. The first one being able to vote. With permanent residents, if they decide that they do want to travel, they do have to have a valid PR card. That's not a requirement at all for citizens, right? You travel with your passport, so you don't have to worry about that. Specifically in terms of a particular individual, I mean, we're happy to speak to you about that individually afterwards, but there are still benefits of becoming a Canadian citizen.
Perfect.
And of course, that's also the guidance from Hazir Mom, right? Is to get your citizenship and make Canada your home.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. There's been a question. I'm trying to make sure that I ask this appropriately. So there's an online application right now, or the online applications right now are for just single applications or multiple applicants at the same time, members of the same family. I'm assuming they're asking if multiple members of the same family can apply for citizenship if they have, let's say, 17 and under individuals in the family.
You'll have to check online. IRCC keeps changing it. They just opened it up this week to people who have representatives as well. So before you couldn't do it that way. But double check on IRCC's website because it does change frequently. That's the best I can tell you right now.
Okay. All right, and I think you might have touched on this, but I'll ask. So there's an individual asking if you already have dual citizenship, if you already have two citizenships, could you apply for citizenship for a third country? I think is what they're trying to ask.
Yeah, you definitely can.
Yeah. Okay. And I think it would be the same requirements, say.
Yeah, same thing.
Okay. Okay. Okay, I think a generic question that I see here is I've done or I have the 1,095 days of physical presence, and I'm about to get my third taxes done next year before April of 2022. Should I wait till I have filed the third one, then start the application, or should I proceed?
If you have 1,095 days, you should already have. Well, let's go back to the eligibility criteria, right? Your eligibility criteria is that you have to have your 1,095 days and that you have filed taxes in 3 of the past 5 years. So yes, if you haven't met that requirement just yet, then you would have to wait until you're eligible before you can apply. But again, I don't want to say specifically whether or not someone is eligible because, it is dependent on your background. If you are looking for whether or not you're eligible, I would recommend speaking with a professional who is able to go through your background specifically and determine whether or not you're qualified to apply at this time.
And again, I just wanted to mention that if we don't actually answer your questions directly, please do reach out to us. Some of these might be on a case-by-case basis that we can further elaborate, that Zia can further elaborate on. And then we also wanted to mention that if you need any support from external agencies or in filling out your application, again, do reach out to us and we might be able to support you with that process. Let me see if there's a few other questions. I think we've answered this. The rest of the questions, I believe that we have actually answered. But again, I'm just going to make sure that we provide our contact information. And while I'm doing that, I'll pass it over back to Nasreen.
Thank you, Nuramin. Thank you, everyone. If there is no any other question, we are going to conclude here. Again, you can always reach out to us through Access Line. You can ask questions through Access Line, and also II Canada and Akbar has our information. But other than that, I think we're good to conclude. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Sorry.
Thank you so much, Zia. I really appreciate. It just took me back to the couple of years ago when I was going through my citizenship, and I know how important it is to get our citizenship in Canada. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, guys. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And